Well, thank you, Dr. Boersma, for that warm introduction. Dr. Boersma was one of the best students I ever taught at LSU. I had the privilege of teaching him, and what he knows he learned on his own, and when he's wrong, it's probably due to me. But you'll see that as we proceed. Thank all of you for coming out, and just feel free to get whatever you have. I think it's great. Have you ever been to the theater in London? If you go to the theater in the United States sometimes, right, everybody comes in and there's a hush, and you sit very quietly and you watch the play. I mean, then modern plays try to disrupt that, right, by walking in the audience and embarrassing everybody. But in London, it's a big party like this, and they've got liquor in the back. Well, wait, no. Okay, well, that's not my business. So whatever the law is in Virginia or at Christendom. See, I had a son who went to Notre Dame, so I know the difference between the state and the church, so to speak. But in London, the theater's like that. So the theater's going on, and mostly there isn't a lot of noise in the background when the play's going on, but they're eating and drinking and all of that at the same time. So I highly recommend the theater in London, and I'm glad to see you imitate that in your own way here in what should one say? England's greatest colony, Virginia. Once colony, Virginia. It's very good to be back at Christendom. I was here about 3 years ago, I think, for a similar lecture. But at that time, your chapel was only a construction site. And so it was really, really beautiful to see this tremendous chapel that you now have. It's a really beautiful chapel, really thoughtful chapter in its different parts and the way it's assimilated things from other churches that have been abandoned, and that's been worked into the architecture. So that was very nice. My topic today is what I'm calling the post-constitutional temptation. Both sides in our increasingly polarized political environment seem impatient today with the Constitution and with the limits that it places on the exercise of power. And by the way, I think there are constitutions in the back. You can just pick those up with your plates and your food. Put them in your pocket. The limits it places on powers. On the left, politicians claim that the political stakes are so high that democracy itself is at risk in the upcoming election, and that their opponents want to suppress it while accusing the Supreme Court of corruption and treating many of its recent constitutional decisions with contempt. On the left, there seems to be an eagerness to change the Constitution, if not discard it entirely, doing away with various checks on national majorities, such as the filibuster. If they can't get rid of the Senate itself with its unequal population electing the different senators, get rid of the Electoral College, is often proposed. And the Supreme Court itself at least has to be, if the objection is not just to the way it's staffed, to the way judges are appointed, or the length of their terms, or the number that have been appointed by presidents on the other side of the spectrum, or whatever it is. What's the alternative? Is it a strong presidency with executive orders and the administrative state, or maybe run by a party itself, a party of like-minded individuals who are in the background pulling the levers of whoever is standing out in front? But on the right, too, I think politicians hold that elections themselves have been corrupted, and that the policies of their opponents put the country at existential risk, justifying urgent and extraordinary action in what they sometimes speak of as if it might be our last election. Perhaps they're happy enough with the system right now if it works for the ends that they're seeking. But nevertheless, on the right, there's great impatience with the entrenchment of law and of rights when they can be used or seem to favor their opponents. Moreover, voices on both sides seem particularly impatient with the Constitution's treatment of religion, with progressives finding claims of religious liberty to be an impediment to social justice, while some conservatives are attracted to forms of Christian nationalism or integralism that find the prohibition on religious establishment disabling in the battle to restore a healthy moral order. Today, I plan to review the sources of our constitutionalism and argue that the frustrations we experience living under the Constitution ought to encourage our self-discipline and that they invite transcendence. Our constitutional order is not the highest good, but it preserves the possibility of things that are better than itself. Well, that at least is my spoiler about where I mean to go. But first I want to talk about what I mean by this phrase, post-constitutionalism. And to define that, of course, I'm going to have to speak about what constitutionalism is. So join me along what I'm afraid is going to be a bit of a wandering path. Post-constitutionalism is a technical term sometimes in political science. It refers to the political authority that emerges when a constitutional regime breaks down, when political elites no longer respect constitutional process, and the general public loses trust in the constitutional government that they elected and obeyed. The paradigmatic instance of a post-constitutional regime is what emerged after the collapse of the Roman Republic. So it's often referred to as Caesarism. Julius Caesar was made dictator for life by the Roman Senate with the enthusiastic support of the Roman people. The dictatorship itself was actually an office at Rome, an irregular one that was nevertheless regulated. At moments of grave crisis, that is, under the Republic it was. At moments of grave crisis, external or internal, the Senate would appoint a dictator and give him absolute power in Rome, but only for 6 months, after which it would return to regular order and then hold the dictator accountable for his choices and his actions. Dictatorship for life, of course, meant the collapse of all of this, for there would be no accountability and no ordinary role for the Senate. And that, of course, precipitated the conspiracy of a few senators to assassinate Caesar, and they were successful in killing him, but not in restoring the Republic, but instead unleashing a new phase of the civil war that had been raging in Rome that led to the institution of a new office called Caesar, an office that effectively became an absolute rulership or empire, imperial office, where the Senate came to be used for the emperor's own devices. And Rome was ruled as an empire for 500 or 1,000 years, depending on whether you're counting in the West or counting in the East. Now, post-constitutionalism reemerged in the early 20th century in Italy, Spain, and Germany, at least. And one of the leading political theorists of the early 20th century in Germany, Carl Schmitt, promoted it there and proved useful to the totalitarian party that rode the post-constitutional wave to a notorious crash in World War II and the Holocaust. My point is not that post-constitutionalism is Nazism, but that the rejection of constitutionalism creates a vacuum in which things like Nazism or Sovietism could arise, the totalitarian government could arise. So what then is this constitutionalism that's being rejected in a post-constitutional moment, or what I'm calling the post-constitutional temptation? Well, I want to describe 3 moments or phases of constitutionalism. I'll call them, for convenience, the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. But I mean by these terms not to confine the types to a single historical era. I might have called them the Aristotelian, the Augustinian Thomistic, and the Lockean, or Hobbesian-Lockean. But rather, I use the dates or the eras simply to refer to when they first emerged. My claim is that we Americans have been fortunate enough to experience a constitutionalism that includes all of these moments and was influenced by all of these philosophers or schools. Not so much synthesized as amalgamated, aggregated into a workable arrangement. So let me discuss these in turn. I won't speculate about the origin of politics, but I will begin by noting that the term politics takes its name from the ancient Greek polis, that emerged sometime before the 5th century BC and was described by its foremost analyst, Aristotle, as a community of men and women sharing a common life and a common understanding of what is just and unjust, noble and base, advantageous and harmful. Or maybe more accurately, as depicted not only by Aristotle, but more especially by historians such as Herodotus and Thucydides, as engaged in a struggle to rule according to these ideas and to act in unison, especially on the battlefield. The Greeks had slaves, but the polis was an association of the free, and they not only fought together, but typically held assemblies and deliberated over war and peace, whom to elect to office, whom to convict of crimes, and whether to change the laws. Aristotle thought the key to understanding any polis was to identify its regime. The Greek word is politeia, and it can be translated as constitution, or transliterated as polity, and then it gets translated into Latin as republic. Aristotle thought there were several types of regime, or several types of constitution, or several types of republic. He names the kingship, the aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny, as well as one type that goes by the generic name polity, or constitution, or constitutional government. And he thought that they could be distinguished according to the number of those who ruled and whether they ruled for the common good or for the advantage just of the ruler. The good regimes aimed at the common good, and most especially at virtue. A good city shared together a life of virtue and took care to cultivate and ensure the virtue of their citizens. Since good men are hard to find, the best regime most cities could hope for would be a polity or constitutional republic, where the rich and the poor and the middle class all shared in government, with the middle class predominating, where military virtue was widespread and the laws were respected. It should be noted that the Greeks worshipped a number of different gods, their temples and cities differing from city to city, and Aristotle mentions in passing the office of priest, which was apparently reserved for retired politicians. There's a difference between paganism and Christianity, I suppose. Although I guess some would say the priests are sometimes aspiring politicians, but I didn't say that. So in the early days, the cult of the city was central to political life, with the king serving as chief priest. But by the 5th and 4th centuries, writers were more interested in the deliberation of assemblies and the exploits of those elected to be generals. Democratic Athens actually retained this office of priest-king, called king, but he was responsible for sacrifices and didn't play a political role. Now, Aristotle and his teacher Plato held that the city existed by nature. That is, it fulfilled the needs of human nature, with Plato going so far as to develop in his Republic an analogy between the parts of the soul and the parts of the city. But both Plato and Aristotle were critics of actually existing cities, particularly for their inability to include space for the philosophic life, as proven by Athens' execution of Socrates. The city where philosophy most thrived put to death its leading philosopher. Plato's proposal that, as reparations, so to speak, philosophers ought to be made kings in general might be read to indicate the limits of politics rather than to propose a serious possibility. And Aristotle, too, contrasts the philosophic life and the political life, presenting them as the noblest alternatives for able men, saying the philosophic is best in itself, but too high for man, at least as something continuous and exclusive. What the Greeks thought was soon enough eclipsed by what the Romans did. The polis, or republic, that conquered the Mediterranean world and undid itself in the process, becoming an empire, as I said before, and thereby discrediting Greek thought for more than a millennium. Now, on to the medieval. St. Augustine, a Roman, right, was also a critic of Rome, a Roman citizen, but a Roman critic. And his great work of political theology, The City of God, was introduced a new epoch in political thought. For he introduced, or rather gave theoretical expression to, a new player in political life, the church, which he described as a city, or rather as a city and not a city, right? Like a city in its unity and its devotion to virtue as its end, but not like an ordinary city and finding its unity in heaven and its happiness in the beatific vision. Christ, of course, lived on earth in the time of Augustus Caesar and his successor Tiberius Caesar, and told. What does it do that? You know what I'm doing to do? Is it when I hit something? It's just when I'm breathing. Okay. So sorry. Christ, of course, told Caesar's agent Pilate that his kingdom was not of this world. That is, Christ's kingdom was not of this world. But already St. Paul refers to the communities of believers as the ecclesia, right? Which was the word the Athenians had used for their assembly, political word. The city of man, or the earthly city, aimed at glory, according to Augustine, and while it inspired acts of extraordinary virtue, its basis was human pride, a sin. The city of God, or heavenly city, had the true end, the glory of God, not man, and the virtues of its members are the virtues of holiness. But while the earthly city is easy enough to recognize and to deplore, Augustine asks whether it's even different from a gang of robbers. The heavenly city is complicated, since it includes, or it entails, both the saints in heaven and the visible church on earth, or rather, all of the former and the holy among the latter, so that there are two interminglings. In the church, those in heaven and on earth, and in the city of man, those who are members of the church, as well as citizens of the city of God. While Augustine is clear that everyone who participates in the visible life of the church is destined for eternal membership, that not everyone who participates in the visible life of the church is destined for eternal membership, he is also clear that it's possible for a good Christian to be a good citizen, even though every earthly city is imperfect. He praises Christian emperors, he praises Christian emperors, he exonerates Christian judges, and he justifies Christian warriors. The peace of the earthly city, imperfect though it is, protects the life of the church, even as the church thus lends to the city upright women and men. Now, Augustine's city of God might be said to have raised or theorized the problem of political life in the Christian era, and especially in the Middle Ages, the history of which was once widely known and is tremendously complicated, at least in Europe, including Byzantium in the east and the rise of national kingships in the west, most of which eventually followed a pattern of hereditary monarchies containing hereditary barons and feudal lords on the one hand, and on the other, a complex structure of bishops under the Pope, as well as monasteries and convents with bishops and abbots often mixing with the nobles in royal councils. Often enough, they came from the same families, these bishops and these nobles. Not to mention the Holy Roman Emperor, elected by some of the German princes in the free cities, and themselves, sometimes, these cities were sometimes ruled by prince bishops. And then, of course, there were universities that figured in this whole story, too. What I want to do, though, is make a few observations about this complex and complicated scheme of medieval constitutionalism, or the medieval moment of constitutionalism. First, I think it's fair to call these complex structures constitutional, even in a modified Aristotelian sense, for they mix together different classes in society, now not rich and poor, though sometimes the commoners or citymen were included in governance, at least in the towns, but rather lay and religious. And they structure their roles and relations according to law, as with different kinds of classes the ancient city did. Second, the different officers were assigned different responsibilities or jurisdictions, and indeed the question of jurisdiction structured many of the debates that they engaged in. Third, at least in the Christian kingships, law was typically or eventually patterned upon Christian morality. So, for example, marriage was held to require the free consent of the parties, to be monogamous, and to last for life, and of course to be between a man and a woman. Fourth, I think it might be said that the state deputed to the church responsibility for forging the agreement of the people as to what is just, noble, and advantageous. These now being defined by church doctrines, and deviation punished by the state as the crime of heresy. Of course, precisely how Christian the laws were as a whole is a matter of no little dispute. Christ in the gospel preached to the poor and promised them access to his kingdom, but these kingdoms and their churches were famously hierarchical and more concerned, it seems, with those well-to-do than with the poor. But it should be said that the law defined rights for all, if more rights for some. In England, at least, in the famous Magna Carta of 1215, so of this era, rights of what they and we call due process were guaranteed to all free men, and some particular rights to women too. Now, medieval Christianity produced numerous legal documents and extensive commentaries, but few works that today we recognize as political theory or political science on a par with Aristotle. Though there's a young Jesuit PhD in political science, William McCormick, who's argued that Thomas Aquinas' tract on kingship to the king of Cyprus. Do you read that here? Has anyone assigned that? Aquinas' On Kingship to the King of Cyprus? No. So there's a book for seniors to write theses on if you're looking for a thesis topic. I think Father McCormick argues that it deserves to be counted as such. He rightly, I think, situates Aquinas between Aristotle and Augustine, drawing from the former the natural goodness of the city, its capacity to allow free men participation in the common good, and to solicit from a king superlative virtue, while at the same time drawing from Augustine a lively sense of the sinfulness of most actual polities and the temptations to tyranny, and thus the need for redemption and the promise of heavenly reward to make politics whole. Although McCormick praises Aquinas for focusing on the person of the king rather than on the jurisdictional disputes between the institutional church and the institutional state, he endorses Aquinas' dualism between the temporal and the spiritual, his clear subordination of the former to the latter, and his insistence both that kings act to lead their subjects to salvation and that they subordinate themselves to the Pope. Aquinas desacralizes kingship and, like Augustine, denounces civil religion, that is, the subordination of religion to the needs of the state. He likewise eschews theocracy, for the king has his proper duties, and these can no more be given to priests than the priestly functions can be given to a king, as they had been in ancient paganism. Still, in the grand scheme of things, as the natural good of happiness points towards and thus ultimately yields to the supreme good of heavenly beatitude, so natural and worldly honor due to a good king must ultimately bend to and acknowledge the spiritual authority of the Holy Father. Now, although McCormick sees in On Kingship, he sees it as designed to fit the genre of Mirrors of Princes, and is attuned throughout to Aquinas' rhetorical constraints in addressing a prince, not, as in the Summa, a student of theology. And to his pedagogical intention in turning an actual prince towards justice and charity, he nevertheless takes at face value, and I think maybe mistakenly, Aquinas' assertion that monarchy is the best regime, and that the startling statement of a few chapters later, indicating with Sallust that men in monarchies, this is Aquinas now in On Kingship, quote, strive more sluggishly for the common good than in a republic where each one attends to it, the common good, as though it were his own. He thinks that's undercut by his critique of polyarchy following soon after, whose continual dissensions lead to civil war. McCormick acknowledges that, at least in principle, some of what Aquinas says of and to the king might apply to a single council or a united people. But whatever might be said about St. Thomas's apparent endorsement of the mixed regime in the Summa, kingship remains preeminent in this little tract. So that's a sort of problem in the political thought of Aquinas. Which one do you take more seriously, the on kingship or what he says in the Summa in question, what is it, 108 or thereabouts, where he talks about the mixed regime in ancient Israel. The king, Aquinas stresses, is a minister of God, even at one point compared to God in an analogy in this book on kingship. And on the other hand, the king is reminded that he's less than God and dependent on him, although kingship itself is exalted. Well, what if kingship were to appear not as a permanent best, but owing its prestige only to the collapse of classical republicanism in Rome? That is, only to this post-constitutional situation that the Europeans faced and gradually recovered from. What if a new principle of unity, say a constitution, were to emerge that mooted Aquinas' chief argument for kingship, that it provides a principle of unity leading to peace, and that could thus tap the potential of human action alluded to in Aquinas' reference to solace that I quoted a moment ago, the fact that in republics, people are more active, more energetic in seeking the common good. Something like this seems to have been on the verge of happening in the Italian republics of several centuries after Aquinas' death, issuing in the Renaissance humanism, whose political principles historian James Hankins is aiming to bring to our attention in his book Virtue Politics, another one I'll recommend to you senior thesis topic lookers. In the history of political thought, as is generally known, however, the movement was diverted at the source by the brilliant work of Machiavelli, who simultaneously reconceived the Mirror of Princes into a how-to manual for enterprising individuals and reimagined republicanism through a reinterpretation of the history of Rome, seeing the civil unrest between the patricians and the plebs as the secret of Roman vitality, not the cause of Rome's decline. What began as an attempt to recover the nobility of political life became an effort to promote the debasement of the spiritual in Machiavelli, or if that's too harsh, to turn the human spirit exclusively towards temporal and worldly things. Coupled with the discoveries of the astronomers that Aristotle had in fact been wrong about the heavens and more generally about nature, or about motion if not nature, there arose the suspicion that he might have been wrong about man in the city and about justice and virtue and all the rest. In the 17th century, in the shadow of Galileo, Thomas Hobbes makes this explicit. So now I move to that third moment, the modern, treating man as a body in motion according to the laws of momentum and calling this natural rights, predicting collision and chaos, and devising the notion of a sovereign power to create an artificial peace while leaving men otherwise free to pursue their own desires. With Hobbes, liberalism is born, though the term won't come into use until the 19th century. And Hobbes explains more clearly than any of his successors the unleashing of individual desire from moral censure, at least in private matters, the need for a powerful state to keep individual autonomy from descending into anarchy, and the interconnection between these two seemingly opposite tendencies. Hobbes's ideas are refined first by John Locke, who adds property as a natural right and explains how unleashing men's desires while rewarding them with the product of their labor can ensure plenty, and who adds limits on government to ensure that plenty is preserved and not squandered. And then this is further refined by Rousseau, who restores the prestige of democracy against the exploitative energy of oligarchs, and then further by developments in Germany and the like. A sketch like this leaves out a lot of things, but it indicates the emergence of liberalism, I think, as is recognizable in our day. And now I want to say a few more words about liberalism and what case could be made for it, or rather, is there any truth in it? I'm presenting these as 3 moments, and I suggested a truth in ancient constitutionalism in its discussion of the polity and its description of the polity and the mixed regime as a good regime. I suggested a truth in the medieval constitutionalism which recognized the independence and the codependence, maybe you could say, of church and state. And now I'm going to ask this question: is there any truth in liberalism? Well, let me hypothesize that the following statement by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan is true. Here's what Hobbes writes: a plain husbandman, he means a farm. You're pointing something at me while I'm saying this. Okay, that's okay. It's just a microphone. Is that okay? So, no, I'm kidding. I just saw, I thought there was a rifle in the bushes, so I didn't. I want to be sure. Here's what Hobbes wrote: a plain husbandman, meaning a farmer, is more prudent in affairs of his own house than a privy councillor in the affairs of another man. I'll say that again. A plain husbandman is more prudent in affairs of his own house than a privy councillor, a member of the highest member of the government, in the affairs of another man, meaning besides himself. Now, that comes from chapter 8 of Leviathan, which is one of a series of chapters between the theoretical account of man as a mechanism and the theoretical account of the state of nature and its political solution that begins in chapter 13. In these chapters, Hobbes means to apply his insights to human society as it actually exists in his time and country, to be a social critic, we might say. Taken in this context, Hobbes's insight about prudence calls into question the classical case for the rule of the wise on 2 grounds. The first is knowledge. As prudence depends upon experience, Hobbes notes, a ruler is not apt to know all that he would need to know to govern an ordinary man's affairs. On the contrary, the individual who manages his own affairs knows them intimately and has learned, maybe by trial and error, maybe by listening to his parents or to his wife's advice, how to be successful in his own trade and in the management of the household, something that involves 1,000 circumstances, some concerning material equipment, some concerning human relationships, that no outsider can know as well as the one who lives in their midst. This insight is the germ, I think, of Friedrich Hayek's later recognition of the unique personal knowledge possessed by every individual who brings a good or service to the market for sale or comes there to purchase what he wants or needs. Knowledge that's unavailable to every central planner, who's the modern privy councillor, so to speak, no matter how many computers or how much data he has at his disposal. The real detailed knowledge that every human being, or every mature human being of at least ordinary capacity, has about what we might call his interests, that is, his own good or advantage in the circumstances of his particular life, is opaque to another, according to Hobbes and Hayek, or at least to another that does not intimately share these circumstances or interests in the same household, and maybe even often to those who do. Now, if the first liberal insight, or the first insight in that phrase of Hobbes's, concerns the individual's knowledge of his own life, the second concerns his attentiveness to his own interests. The privy councillor will not, unless a saint with a great soul, care nearly so much about the plain husbandman's good as he does for his own good. And I intend the ambiguity of that sentence, for the ruler and the subject will each care more for his own good than for the good of the other. This, of course, is central to Hobbes' psychology, for Hobbes writes again and again, the object of every man's actions is some good to himself. While the observation admits of some exceptions, probably every teenage boy goes through a phase when he is much less concerned and attentive to his own well-being than his mother is for her sons. Still, right. So the older guys all laugh. That was exactly right, you know. If you didn't laugh, you're not through it yet, but you'll see. Mother was right. Still, it's an insight it's not an insight to be readily dismissed by anyone who takes an honest look at human nature. The plain husbandman, in short, is more prudent in his own affairs First, because he knows them more intimately than another could. And second, because almost no one will care more for his affairs than he does himself. Now, Hobbes theorizes these insights in two different directions, and I don't want to follow him blindly in either one of these. He wants to replace, for the Privy Councillor, prudence with science. And then secondly, he wants to abstract from this prudence that the individual has for himself into a general agnosticism about what is good. Nevertheless, Hobbes, practically speaking, thinks men's desires converge sufficiently to make them competitive with one another, and then experiencing the dangers of competition to make them generally agree that the fear of death is evil. This is, of course, the only common good, or rather the common evil, that Hobbes needs to develop his natural laws and his doctrine of sovereignty, as you'll learn when you study Hobbes. And that sovereignty will leave men the liberty to pursue most of their other various goods as their diverse or different hearts desire. Now, John Locke follows Hobbes in recognizing the individuality of human interests, or definitions of the good. In his essay concerning human understanding, in the crucial chapter 21 of Power, Locke speaks of what he calls, quote, the relish of our minds to the true intrinsic good or ill that is in things. And then he clarifies that the mind has a different relish as well as the palate, meaning from mind to mind. People's tastes differ, and so their thoughts also differ. And he continues, it was, I think, that the philosophers of old did in vain inquire whether the summum bonum consisteth in riches, or in bodily delights, or virtue, or contemplation. And they might have as reasonably disputed whether the best relish were to be found in apples, plums, or nuts. Characteristically, Locke is more guarded than Hobbes in his expression of the variability of the good, and by contemporary liberal standards, his linking of the variation of moral or intellectual relishes to differences of palates might appear downright conservative in that it accepts bodily differences as real and paradigmatic, rather than subject to imaginative whim and redesign or redesignation. Like Hobbes, Locke rejects the classical notion of the highest good, but he does not seem to say that the good is anything a man desires, or at least he suggests that desire is bounded. As for prudence, the whole project of his essay is to consider the working of every man's mind, and the individuality of minds and their perception and choices is a theme that runs all the way through the book. Locke is the one who coined the phrase pursuit of happiness that Jefferson adopts, and he coins it in the essay concerning human understanding, not in the second treatise. Most men, it seems, make judgments based on their opinions about what is probable, and there's little I find in Locke to suggest he would not endorse Hobbes's statement about the plain husbandman and the privy councillor. Indeed, I think he would endorse it more fully than Hobbes himself, who thinks that prudence can ultimately be replaced by science, or at any rate that the sovereign can command what councillors only advise, while Locke turns men's attention to the management of their property and wants government to be based on their continuing consent. Racing a century ahead in the story of liberalism, one finds in Adam Smith's principle of the division of labor another perspective in that liberal tradition, this time with an emphasis not on natural differences, but on the general advantage of socially cultivating differences. Here's Smith, I'll quote him, "The difference of natural talents in different men is, in reality, much less than we are aware of, being, quote, not so much the cause as the effect of the division of labor," writes Smith. "What is universal among men is first, quote, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. And second, quote, the desire of bettering our condition, a desire which, though calm and dispassionate, comes with us from the womb and never leaves us till we go to the grave." These three principles, division of labor, exchange, and self-improvement, make possible a dynamic society capable of producing hitherto unimagined wealth and progress, providing that the government, too, learns the importance of frugality and restricts itself to providing defense, justice, public works that facilitate commerce, and education, although Smith was a severe critic of the universities in his day, having taught in one. And most importantly, as long as government does not interfere with the natural working of the market on matters of international trade. Now, I noted at the outset, but didn't mention here, liberalism's, no, that part I'm not going to do. Let me then proceed. Give me a second, I'm sorry, I've lost my place here. Right. Liberalism, I think, whatever you think of liberalism, I do want to suggest that it's arguably responsible for a number of practices and principles that we today take as axiomatic in contemporary political life, principles which I think even at Christendom would not be denied. Here they are: the abolition of slavery, for starters; the development of a free market economy, which made slavery unnecessary and introduced that unprecedented plenty; the emancipation of women from imposed restrictions on their education and their liberty; the promotion of science and the consequent technologies that have relieved human suffering and enhanced human possibilities; and the attention to the dignity and equality of all human beings, regardless of race or ethnic origin. One could say that all of these achievements, with the possible exception of the second, the market economy, had their origin in Christianity. But I'm not sure that that would prove more than that liberalism is a Christian heresy, as many have alleged. For better or worse, liberalism has pressed for all of these things I listed more fervently than has the Catholic Church, I think. Though it might be argued that the extreme versions of liberalism and the reactions that they've produced have undercut even these achievements. The history of political philosophy doesn't end with Rousseau or Hegel or even John Stuart Mill, of course, but proceeds through Marx and Nietzsche, the grandfathers or grandfathers of the totalitarians of the 20th century. Now, I've given you a definition of post-constitutionalism and then a long account of constitutionalism in its three moments or three waves. My question in conclusion for those tempted by post-constitutionalism is, what part or moment of these constitutionalisms would you want to discard? First, perhaps it's the mixed regime, Aristotle's polity or constitutional government, with its mixture of rich and poor and its emphasis on the middle class. Actually, this I don't yet see among post-constitutionalists, even if there is a certain obliviousness about the role of wealth and necessity in political life, about the source of wealth in one party, which seems to think it just happens, and then about the real-life consequences of its typical distribution in the other party. Each party naturally aims to dominate the other. That's sort of the nature of parties, right? They know they're apart, they call themselves a party, but they aim to describe the common good, the good for the whole. And each party naturally wants to eliminate the other, or at least dominate the other, I think. But a mixed constitutional order, as we once were, I think, in that each party recognizes that we need, or at least need to learn to live with the other party. And that even though we want to beat them in the next election, as partisans of whichever party you're a member of or a partisan of, we want them to lose the next election. We realize when we take a step back that actually it's probably been a good thing for our constitutional order that different parties have been in power in different times, that there's a kind of taking turns in ruling, which is part of Aristotle's definition of how a polity operates, that ruling and being ruled in turn. Aristotle suggests that shoring up the middle class is the key to a successful polity. And that might require explicit policy, of course, right? Support for families in the form of, say, something like the home mortgage deduction or education vouchers or the like. But also a cultural policy that encourages family formation, as economic policies do not always. Okay, so maybe the post-constitutionalists aren't going after Aristotle exactly. Actually, you probably haven't heard of Aristotle, but if they have, they aren't going after him. They might have heard of the middle class, certainly heard of the middle class, and no one quite is yet ready to denounce the middle class. Well, maybe a few on either side. But what about the second moment, the medieval inheritance of the separation of church and state institutionally? Here, perhaps, the dispute is between those who want one or the other to rule, one to rule, rather, and the other to serve. But in a closely divided country and era like our own, it's a recipe for at least cold civil war. That's what culture war, when we use the phrase culture war, I think that's what we're talking about. Not to accept on either side the arrangement that came to us providentially, so to speak, limiting the role of government to temporal concerns and allowing faith to aim at spiritual formation. Why should either be jealous of the other's sphere? Do you think I make them too equal and presenting it, well, one or the other, each in its own sphere? Well, that would only be so if the spiritual and the temporal, the body and the soul, are equal, and if the relation of the relative order of these is misunderstood. Isn't the remedy for that education or evangelization, not coercion? Finally, is the enemy individual liberty and the equal rights to property and political involvement the problem? I mentioned above contemporary obliviousness about economics and its role in human society, which I think is part of the problem, but I think the greater problem is the failure to recognize the connection between liberty and virtue. Constitutional government secures and organizes human liberty, that is, rights in action, and in offices. But it only works if liberty is well exercised, that is, if it's used for virtuous actions. If virtue can be forced, constitutional government can be discarded. But because virtue can't be forced, the latter mustn't be lost. Thank you. Okay, well, I hope, said enough that's provocative of questions. And I'm happy to take those for as long as you want to ask them, or until Dr. Boersma has to throw us out because someone else is throwing a pizza party or whatever else is happening. So go ahead. You want to go ahead and ask.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the talk. Wonderful encompassing of the history of politics. You mentioned the three main periods. So there was ancient, medieval, and then modern. And then the question if virtue can be forced and can throw out constitutional government. What kind of virtue should we be reading into the statement then? Should it be Machiavellian virtue or like virtue?
Oh, yeah.
Or should one period be prioritized over the other? Like
Right.
what kind of constitution?
Right. Oh, that's very good. So that's good. That would be a fun sort of complement then to say the three eras of virtue, right? So the first Aristotelian virtue, the second Thomistic or the theological virtue. I mean, Thomas does that for us, right? He has the natural virtues, the human virtues, and then the theological virtues that he adds to the cardinal virtues, theological virtues, and then are there new virtues that Machiavelli introduces? Well, insofar as what Machiavelli is causing virtue includes injustice, I wouldn't call that, let's not call that virtue, right? Let's not. He says that at one point, right? Isn't there? Though one wouldn't call cruelty a virtue, and then he calls it a virtue. So I don't want to do that. Right? Well, no, he does, right? When he's talking about, which is the Agathocles, or his inhuman cruelty, but then he calls it his infinite other virtues, and that seems cruelty was a virtue. But no, okay, so I'm not saying that. But it does seem to me that there are certain commercial virtues that the modern world has introduced and taught us, and those include the virtues of enterprise, of entrepreneurship, right? And the virtues of stepping up and taking charge of something, not just doing one's duty, right? But imagining something that wasn't otherwise done or known. Now, these virtues are especially shown by, or we recognize them maybe most dramatically in those who have developed new businesses or discovered new things, right? So it's scientists and entrepreneurs of different sorts. But I think actually, and this is this little theme of liberalism as Christian heresy, I think this is what the apostles did at some level. These were sort of the origin of entrepreneurship in some ways is the activity of the apostles going into strange places and if they aren't accepted, kick the dust off their feet, right? And go look to another place and teach something really new. Now, they had a special teacher, right? And it was teaching about the eternal things. But maybe it models a sort of openness to what is unknown and hasn't been experienced that you don't find among the ancients. I mean, the ancients, that's reserved only for thought and philosophy, I think. And so first through evangelization, I guess you could say, and then this sort of temporal following along of that. I think it's done good. I think they're real, genuine goods that modern society, and therefore, in that sense, modern liberalism, at least understood in the context of a constitutionalism. I mean, there are forms of liberalism that reject classical constitutionalism and so forth, and that's not what I'm proposing. I'm proposing them amalgamated together. But I think there is something new and something that the modern world develops and achieves, and really achieves, and we ought to acknowledge that. And that those are virtues that one can have without sacrificing the other virtues, even though for any individual's life, you're not going to be able to be all of these things. I mean, my daughter has a good friend who got a PhD in chemistry from Columbia and then entered a convent in New Jersey where they make soap, and that's their project. They need chemists too, you know. And okay, so she's maybe being able to do 2 of the 3 or something of that sort, but no one is going to be able to exercise all of those. That's part of Hobbes's point, right? That there are many different lives, and each person has to kind of work out for himself or herself that order of life, at least with regard to the temporal thing. Well, not just with regard to the temporal things, because one has a different, there are different lives with regard to the spiritual things, right? And it's not that one can't bracket off, and this is the Machiavellian problem, right? You've got to be able to rule out, which if you keep the old virtues you could do, you've got to be able to rule out vicious action that makes money, right, and is entrepreneurial. Or you've got to be able to rule, as you got to be able to rule vicious action that seems to promote the faith. You know, that's happened too. There was a lot that happened on the Crusades, not necessarily the Crusades themselves, but that happened on the Crusades that was not going to meet anybody's test of virtue, except maybe Machiavelli's. Does that address it? So I think that's the argument. I mean, that's, and you're right. That's the argument I would have to make, is to sort those out. So I should have prepared a 2-hour lecture instead of a 1 hour and then gone through the, no, okay, I was joking. Although John can tell you I can talk for 3 hours straight pretty much, so don't tempt me. But that's a great question. That's a great question. Who else? What else? Yes?
Would you say that monarchy is compatible with constitutionalism?
That monarchy
is compatible with constitutionalism?
Oh yeah, well the medieval monarchies were constitutional monarchies. I mean, there is such a thing as constitutional monarchy. And you find that even in the Declaration of Independence, right? Where the problem is that the king is no longer fit to be the ruler of a free people, which means a king could be the ruler of a free people, or you could have them compatible. Now, it's not compatible with absolute monarchy, unless, I suppose, in an extraordinary moment where you need an extremely wise person, right? This moment like a Roman dictatorship, you need someone extremely wise to solve an extremely problematic situation. But short of that, constitutional monarchy seems indeed to be an appropriate form. And I think that's part of what the medievals worked out. And I spoke of the providential elements in American constitutionalism. One is that we took a constitutionalism inherited from a monarchy and then adjusted it to work in a republican circumstance, right? But that means we inherited a judicial power and the whole common law that went along with that from its monarchical, Christian monarchical background, right? The common law was developed in Catholic England. And so I think that was crucial to us, and it's a matter of great good fortune that we inherit that. Oh, inheritance too is a principle from medieval constitutionalism, right? It was sort of central to it. And so it was great good fortune that we have that. Not everybody has that inheritance, right? And some people have thrown it away when they had it. And of course we forget that. I think that inheritance is often overlooked. And one reason why when Americans go abroad and advertise our form of government to other countries and then we blame them when it doesn't work, it's partly because we didn't understand ourselves well enough to realize what advantages we had, what else we inherited, what was part of our unwritten constitution, especially common law that went along with the written constitution. So sure, that's possible. Not necessarily for us, right? I mean, the constitutional monarchies in Europe came about through, again, their sort of inheritance that came about from the tribal origins of their societies. We don't have that, right? We've been in a way republican from the start, in that we had these many different colonies and they were established by people who had fled the old world, and they acknowledged only a distant constitutional monarch. Where would you find the monarch among Americans? I mean, I guess it's possible that an extremely gifted and wise man or woman could come along and suddenly all Americans would say, the Obamas will be king forever. Well, I mean, it's like the only, yeah, right? Wasn't that the only I mean, I think it might be that my own theory of, you want to stop the tape? No, I'm kidding. my own theory of what's been going on in politics for the last so many years is that this is Obama's third term, and now maybe he's figured out how to get a fourth term, and if he lives through that, he'll outdo Roosevelt. But short of something like that, where you could really find, I just don't see it in the American past. In the same way that in England, the English are going to keep their monarchical family, or have kept the monarchical family, as learning that that's been key to maintaining peace. They fell into civil war when they tried to do away with the king, and now they tolerate all sorts of things on the parts of their monarchs, although they had a pretty virtuous one until recently. And so that was no comment. Well, we don't have to worry about whether it's a comment, right? We're not in England. So, they, in the same way that the British realized that somehow to be true to themselves and maintain to maintain the inheritance and not squander it, they want to keep their monarchy. In a way, we're in the opposite situation, right? That never having had a monarch, really. Well, we had Washington, we had Lincoln, but Washington made a point of promoting rotation in office because he resigned. He resigned first. He resigned twice, right? He resigned first as commander-in-chief of the army, and he resigned a second time. We didn't resign, but I mean, he refused to stand for election for a third term and established that two-term tradition, which held as a tradition, an unwritten tradition, because Washington had established it. And so, so even the one we could have had as a pattern for a monarchy explicitly eschewed anything like monarchy. Lincoln met a different end, but nobody would have thought he would have run for a third term. I don't think, if he had lived to do so. So I just don't see, in principle it's possible. For us, I don't see it as possible without really breaking something that's been important to us, right? And that's been central to us, right? Because it means we're saying we can't be Republican anymore. And it's not an impossible truth. I mean, it's not impossible that it's true. It might have been that the Romans couldn't be Republican anymore in the year 27 BC, right? That it just wasn't possible. They'd been through, by then, 100 years of civil war, close to it, and it just was not possible. But let's give it the 100 years, if we're going to have to go that way, and not say, well, since 2015 it's been impossible, so therefore republicanism is broken. That's much too soon. Give it a chance. My opinion. Yes?
So, Doctor, are you familiar with, and I'm going to take this question in a different direction.
Yeah.
Away from the U.S. courts, other nations who have constitutions,
Yes.
but have kind of descended into post-constitutionalism.
Yes.
So, are you familiar with what's happening in Salvador right now?
In El Salvador. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's right. That's been pointed to where you have a real dictatorial government that's seems to have solved, at least temporarily, a problem of criminal gangs. And yeah, that would be on the classic Roman model, right? But it would have to return. That's what I'm not familiar with is what is the plan to return to constitutional order, right?
Yeah, that's my question actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
How would they, or how would naive Kennedy ensure like a long-term return after his state of exception?
Yeah, so one of the most interesting parts of Aristotle's Politics, one of the curious parts is in Book 5, if you read Book 5 of the Politics, and that's where he talks about change in government, right? And there he talks at one point about how to be a good tyrant. And in one paragraph, he gives sort of the Machiavellian solution, proving he knows what Machiavelli knew. And then he says, but there is another way. And he explains how it is that the tyrant, the basic answer is act like a king, right? And seek the common good of your people. And instead of trying to divide them and turn them against one another to keep yourself in power, okay, do what you have to stay in power, but build up, we would say today, build up civil society, right? Build up your people and return or facilitate a return to the rule of law. And although it might be that the tyrant can't, the dictator can't become a king, nevertheless, he could lay the groundwork for that. I'll give you an example we've seen, we saw it even in the 20th century. And that was Franco. So when I mentioned the post-constitutional regimes, one of them I mentioned Spain, and that was a reference to the dictator Franco. And that was a very controversial dictatorship, although it seems that his victory might have been supported by military arms that came from Germany and Italy. He nevertheless didn't turn around and support Germany and Italy in World War II. He stayed neutral. And Spain remained neutral, even though the rest of the world was at war. And then, in his old age, you know what he did? He found the son of or the grandson, I guess, of the old monarch, and sort of brought him forth as successor, Juan Carlos, to be king, because the monarchy had been taken over and had fallen apart, had been taken over by parliamentarians who had, I guess, overthrown the monarchy and made themselves republicans and so forth. And here he finds that at the time a young man, and he kind of appoints him his successor before he dies. And then what does Juan Carlos do? He establishes a constitutional monarchy in Spain. And a few years later, a few years later, there was actually an attempt in Parliament. I think some of the military came into Parliament and started shooting things up or whatnot. And Juan Carlos made it clear right away that he was not going to support the military. Franco's old troops, the post-Franco, the people, I guess, who thought they should rule after Franco. He was a military dictatorship. They were the military. They ought to be dictators. And he supported instead the Republicans, and the parliamentarians. And that reestablished, in a way, a constitutional order in Spain. It was very funny. Can I tell you we have time for a personal anecdote. So here's a personal anecdote. I happened to be in grad school at the time, and the university where I was, which was a very fancy place, and figured if something great happened in the world, they better put their stamp of authority on it, right, or stamp of approval on it. And so Harvard invited Juan Carlos to be the commencement speaker. And clearly they were invited, this was the next year, and so clearly they were inviting him because he had stood up for constitutional government, right? And so it's the only time I ever saw King in person. And because I somehow slipped in there to graduation, even though I wasn't done yet. And he gave a speech. And guess what his speech was about? It had nothing to do with constitutionalism, right? It was about the greatness of the Spanish language and the literature of Latin America and all of this. And I remember thinking at first, what? And then I thought, well, of course, he's the king. He's being a constitutional monarch. He's interested in the whole culture of the people that he represents. And that's what a monarch can supply. It's not the politics. He didn't play much of a political role. And I think, is he still alive? I think he's still alive. He shot an elephant the other year. And, well, but it got, pictures of it got out, and so then he had to abdicate for his son. So there is, I mean, there's a certain precariousness to the constitutional monarchy in Spain and is in general in the government in Spain. But nevertheless, that's an interesting story of a move from dictatorship back to constitutionalism. So we've actually seen it in one place. And I don't think that's what Spanish language again, so it might, I mean, presumably, if this guy really is wise in El Salvador, this is what he would do, is move from being the dictator to a return of authority to a more constitutional sort of governance. Once you've established that law-breaking is out, show that lawfulness actually is the course of peace and the course of justice. So, we have to finish.
We are unfortunately out of time. I've heard there's a pizza party to get to. So,
Whatever it is.
But if you would all join me in thanking Dr. Stone.
Thank you very much.